Spouse points out a recurring behavior, not harshly, not aggressively, just enough to invite reflection. You listen, but internally your attention drifts. You remember the times you did try, you recall how much you sacrifice, you think of the ways they fall short. And by the time the conversation ends, you feel misunderstood rather than curious. The ego has already protected the identity of being reasonable, patient, or long-suffering. You don't say, I don't want to look at this. You say, this isn't fair. And because fairness sounds moral, the inquiry stops. Self-deception operates before morality enters the picture. Long before you decide whether you're right or wrong, the ego has already decided for you what this moment means. By the time you justify yourself ethically, the deeper work has already been done. There's a familiar moment most people recognize, though they rarely name it. It happens in ordinary life, not during reflection or prayer or deep thought, but in the middle of everyday conversations and situations. Could be a comment from a spouse, a question from a colleague, a look that lingers half a second too long, a feeling of irritation that arrives before you know why. And in that instant, before you respond outwardly, something shifts inwardly. The mind adjusts. You don't notice the adjustment because it feels natural. It feels rational and sensible to you. You explain yourself internally before anyone else has even spoken. You soften what has just happened. You reframe that feeling as to what you've just felt. You tell yourself a story that lets you move on without pausing. And the moment passes. That is where the self-deception lives inside each and every single one of us. Not in dramatic lies, but in these small internal edits that happen so fast they feel like clarity rather than avoidance. You see this when someone challenges you gently and you feel a tightening in your chest. Not anger, but more like resistance. And before you can even ask why, your mind supplies an answer. They don't understand me, or they're projecting, or this isn't worth engaging with. The explanation arrives fully formed, and with it comes relief. You no longer have to stay with that discomfort. This is self-deception. And self-deception is not the absence of awareness. It is awareness that stops just short of honesty. The ego does not survive by denying reality outright. It survives by changing the meaning. It lets the event exist, but it rewrites what it represents. It keeps the fact and edits the interpretation. And because the interpretation feels reasonable, the ego remains intact. This happens constantly in relationships. A spouse points out a recurring behavior, not harshly, not aggressively, just enough to invite reflection. You listen, but internally your attention drifts. You remember the times you did try, you recall how much you sacrifice, you think of the ways they fall short. And by the time the conversation ends, you feel misunderstood rather than curious. The ego has already protected the identity of being reasonable, patient, or long-suffering. You don't say, I don't want to look at this. You say, this isn't fair. And because fairness sounds moral, the inquiry stops. Self-deception operates before morality enters the picture. Long before you decide whether you're right or wrong, the ego has already decided for you what this moment means. By the time you justify yourself ethically, the deeper work has already been done. This is why self-deception doesn't feel dishonest. It feels calming. It feels like you're resolving something. You feel settled, not conflicted, and that is the sense of settlement that you are justifying. In work environments, the same mechanism plays out quietly. A colleague questions your decision. A subordinate resists your direction. You feel irritation, but it's quickly reframed. They're not seeing the bigger picture. They lack experience. I'm responsible for results. Each thought may contain a grain of truth, but the speed with which they arrive is not accidental. They arrive fast enough to prevent you from asking a more uncomfortable question. Why did this bother me so much? The ego is not protecting correctness, it is protecting coherence. It wants your self-image to remain consistent, competent, justified, and reasonable. And most of the times it's just only reasonable and rational to you. Anything that threatens that coherence creates friction. And friction feels dangerous to the ego, even when it's harmless in reality. So the mind learns to smooth things over. And this is where selective attention becomes crucial. Not what you think about, but what you don't linger on. Because the ego becomes skilled at moving attention away from certain internal signals. A hesitation, you ignore; a tightness, you distract yourself from; a pattern, you explain quickly so you don't have to sit with it. You see this after disagreements. You replay the other person's tone, their words, their timing, but you skip over your own internal reaction. The spike of defensiveness, the need to be right, the urge to withdraw. Attention becomes outward because inward would be too revealing. This happens to so many of us. When we get into an argument, we very rarely point out our own faults. We are always looking at the other person's shortcomings. So over the sort of long period of time, this creates blind spots, not because you are incapable of seeing, but because you have trained yourself away from certain directions. The ego learns where not to look. It basically ignores the blind spots. And these blind spots are not random. They form around us in a loop in such a way that it becomes part of our identity. Wherever you sense you are being good, being strong, independent, being generous, you're being principled, just remember at that very moment in time, your self-deception will be the most active. This is why some people who pride themselves on kindness struggle to see how and when they become quietly manipulative over others or to others. Why someone who values independence struggles to admit their emotional avoidance. Why someone who identifies as principled person struggles to notice how they often align themselves to convenience rather than the truth. The ego doesn't protect everything equally. It protects what matters most to who you think you are. Motive is another area where self-deception operates with precision. Most people believe they understand why they do what they do, but motive is rarely transparent. It is layered with all other mixture of concoctions of intentions and ideas, often contradictory as well, and even harmful. But the ego does not see that way, and because it doesn't like that complexity. So it simplifies it. You help because you're generous. You withdraw because you're mature. You persist because you're disciplined. You let go because you're wise. Each explanation fits neatly within your own self-image. What gets trimmed away is whatever doesn't fit that identity and what you have created. The resentment mixed into the generosity, the fear beneath the maturity, the need for control behind the discipline. This is all subtle, but it feels efficient to you. Memory then sort of joins all the dots together, and you remember conversations in a way that supports your position. You remember your effort more vividly than your resistance. You remember how much you gave, not how much you withheld. And you always forget what the other person gave. And over a period of time, your memory only records enough to reinforce that image that you have created. This is why self-deception strengthens with age if it is not challenged. The longer an identity is maintained, the more the past is unconsciously edited to support it. Contradictions are softened, doubt is reframed, inconsistencies are explained away, and eventually the story feels strong. This is why people create a powerful shield around them, not necessarily of arrogance, but they think it's quiet certainty. The kind that says, I already understand this. This is the kind that closes the door gently rather than shutting things out. Self-deception thrives in that quiet closure. True peace can hold uncertainty. It can admit confusion. It can remain open. The calm produced by self-deception is different. It depends on not being disturbed. It depends on certain questions never being asked, never being challenged. That's why even gentle challenge can feel irritating. Why a simple observation can feel intrusive. It's not the comment that threatens the ego, it's the direction it points towards. Inwardly, this is where self-deception cannot survive long enough if that attention stays there. This is why the ego prefers to move on, and rather than be still and ponder and reflect. By not reflecting, you will never be able to understand or become aware of these internal patterns which are running your life on a autopilot. It's a software that which is just running your life. And what happens is that without confronting these patterns, we carry on living our life in ignorance by maintaining this false momentum. It's only when you are prepared to stop and disrupt that pattern and become uncomfortable with the way your life is running, that's when you can sit back and truly reflect how you've got here, and to ask yourself, am I happy with this level of self-deception that has been created in my life, like an internal script? Or is it time now to change that script and be aligned to a different reality and live my life on a more truthful path, rather than constantly deceiving myself with this internal script which I have created over the years and decades, which has become part of my identity. As self-deception deepens, it doesn't become louder, it becomes calmer. It sheds emotional excess. It learns restraint. This is the stage where people often mistake composure for clarity and stability for truth. The ego no longer reacts impulsively. It waits, it listens, it nods. It appears reflective. When challenged, it doesn't argue, it pauses, it considers, and then it decides quietly that it is already correct. This is the ego that has absorbed insight without surrendering to it. You see this in people who are sincerely trying to be good. They care about fairness, they care about ethics, they care about not wanting to harm others. And because those intentions feel genuine, examination softens. The eternal pressure to question motive weakens. The assumption of goodness becomes a resting place. A person speaks firmly in a disagreement and later reassures themselves that they were just being honest. They withdrew emotionally and tell everyone that they are giving space. They hold on to resentment while convincing themselves they are being patient. Each explanation is plausible. Each one sounds mature, and each one allows the deeper truth to remain untouched. Because one of the ego's safest shelters is this false sense of sincerity, especially when it goes unchecked. It's when it remains unexamined. Because once a person believes they mean well, they stop looking closely at what their actions actually do, because that impact is replaced by intention, consequence is replaced by motive, and the ego remains unchallenged. Not because it is invisible, because it is trusted. They trust themselves. Morality plays a similar role, not immorality, but morality. The ego learns how to stand on the correct side of things. It adopts the right positions. It speaks the right language. It aligns itself with the values that make questioning feel unnecessary, even inappropriate. This shows up when someone becomes difficult to challenge because they're always right in principle. Any disagreement feels like an attack on values rather than an invitation for them to reflect upon. Any feedback that anyone gives them feels like a misunderstanding rather than information. The person doesn't defend aggressively, they defend implicitly by standing on this moral ground. And standing on this moral ground feels very solid for them. It seems like an unnegotiable position, but morality does not guarantee honesty. It can just as easily obscure it. A person may genuinely look that they are opposing injustice while quietly enjoying the sense of superiority that comes with being morally correct. They may speak about compassion while avoiding accountability in their own relationships. They may criticize harm in others while being blind to the subtle ways that they perhaps harm and control others. None of this feels deceptive from the inside. It feels principled. And this is again another big blind spot, because the self-deception inside of them allows them to carry on with this irrational analysis. Another layer appears when people learn to intellectualize their inner life, not shallow overthinking, but refined explanation. The mind becomes adept at commentary. It narrates experience instead of inhabiting it. It explains emotions instead of feeling them fully. You see this when someone talks fluently about their fears without ever trembling, when they describe their wounds without pain, when they can analyze their patterns in detail while continuing to live inside them. And this because the ego stays one step removed, safe, observing, never fully touched. This distance creates the illusion of depth without vulnerability. The person sounds insightful, thoughtful, self-aware, but something essential is missing: the contact. Self-deception here doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from insulation. The mind keeps experience at arm's length, so identity remains intact. This is also where false acceptance enters quietly. Real acceptance is alive. It allows things to be seen clearly without resistance. It creates space. It invites change naturally. False acceptance does the opposite. It closes the door gently and calls it wisdom. This is just how I am. I've made peace with it. I don't need to fix everything. These phrases can reflect maturity, but they can also conceal a resignation, conceal something else hidden deep within the personality, a subtle decision to stop questioning, to stop feeling unsettled, to stabilize rather than transform. You see this when someone stays emotionally distant in relationships and calls it independence, when they avoid difficult growth and call it contentment, when they limit themselves quietly and call it realism. And that is precisely why it works. Another place where self-deception settles is in the equation of calm with correctness. If something feels peaceful, it must be right. If something creates tension, it must be wrong. But calm can be produced by avoidance just as easily as by the truth. Just give you an example. Maybe there's something that causes you not to address it. You bury your head in the sand and you avoid something. That doesn't mean the problem will go away. The truth has been masqueraded. It's just because of this avoidance has given you this false sense of peace and comfort, and by addressing it, it's going to give you discomfort, and this discomfort often accompanies clarity long before it yields peace. Someone avoids a necessary conversation perhaps because it disturbs their peace. Someone declines responsibility because it feels heavy. Someone chooses distance because closeness creates tension, and each decision brings this false relief, momentary release, and that's why it feels good temporarily, but the relief is not the truth. It is simply the absence of pressure, and the ego prefers these states that feel resolved, but it's not resolved. It's like growth often requires imbalance. It requires holding contradictions and tackling them. It requires staying with questions that don't resolve neatly. This is the continuous momentum of self-deception that we maintain in ourselves. The self-deception that momentarily feels the peace but overrides the commitment. This is why stillness can feel threatening to people, not because it reveals answers, because it removes distraction. Without movement, without explanation, without this false narrative, patterns are revealed, they come to the surface. Emotional undercurrents make themselves known, and the ego responds immediately. It fills the space with thought, with memory, with meaning, with planning, with psychological framing, anything that prevents awareness from settling long enough for something uncomfortable to become undeniable. That's why silence is dangerous to this self-deception, because silence does not cooperate. It does not justify, it does not explain. It doesn't protect the identity. It simply reveals when these stories are being told and why this genuine self-honesty is rare. Not because people are malicious, it's because they do not want to go to these places where the ego gets challenged and these labels have to be removed, and where the old explanations no longer feel sufficient. Those spaces are not dramatic, they are quiet, often boring and profoundly uncomfortable. They do not offer reassurance, they just offer the constant sort of label of a false identity, of self-assurance, which ultimately, as you know, is self-deception. And this is when self-deception can collapse only if you stay in that discomfort long enough to be able to address those false explanations that you have created. So you need to resist the urge to conclude that that this is okay. You need to address and move on from the old habits that you have created for decades perhaps. As I mentioned before, the older you become, the more solid this identity and the self-deceptions perpetuate and become part of your identity. And you lose this clarity over time, and you live basically a false sense of reality. And this is why it's important to sometimes sit back and challenge this narrative that you have created yourself. Because you have created it, you don't feel that it's morally right, that it should be challenged. So this is where freedom begins to take root, where you can truly become free from these labels, from this self-deception that you have wrapped yourself around. This can happen not in a dramatic way, not suddenly, but slowly and steadily, just through this insight and this refusal to keep lying to yourself in ways that feel reasonable. That refusal changes everything. And this is why we all need to sometimes stop and sit in silence and look inwardly for all those wrong self-deceptions which are formed in our life, which have been created by ourselves.